Right, hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar on classifying and protecting your data with Microsoft 365 Compliance Solutions. I'm Jason Lee. I'm the collaboration and content lead at Chorus. We are a Microsoft Gold partner in the UK. So the plan for today, I will very quickly set the scene, classification and protection at a glance. Then we'll look at the three key areas. We'll look at information classification, information protection, and data loss prevention. If we've got time at the end, I'll take a closer look at some of the building blocks as well, the automation building blocks that glue all of this together. So classification and protection at a glance. Microsoft 365 Compliance is a big sprawling platform. It's growing all the time. They group their compliance solutions into three broad areas. So we've got information protection and governance, which is all about how you understand and classify your data, how you manage the information lifecycle, how you protect sensitive information. Inside of risk management, that's all about how you detect inappropriate communication within your company, how you detect any risky activity. And then finally, discovery and response is about how you respond to discovery requests, how you respond to data subject requests, how you review user activity, admin activity, and so on. So all of the areas we're looking at today fit into the information protection and governance capabilities in Microsoft 365 Compliance. So broadly, that's four solutions that you'll see in the admin center. We've got information governance, records management, information protection, and data loss prevention. And as we go through and talk about some of the different tools, I'll call out exactly where to find them in these solutions. Okay, so information classification and governance. What are the challenges here? We're really trying to understand what kind of information we're storing. We're trying to get a better handle on what information we're storing as an organization across all of our data stores, whether it's SharePoint Online, whether it's Teams, OneDrive for Business, Exchange mailboxes, even third-party cloud solutions and file systems. We're also trying to ensure that our content is stored in line with any requirements. So they might be legal or regulatory requirements. They might be requirements that are specific to your business. They're typically about how you protect information from deletion while you're obliged to keep it. Preserve information in some cases to meet any record keeping requirements. Remove information when you're obliged to, when you no longer have a use for it or you're obliged to get rid of it, and to provide proof of deletion where required to show that you actually have disposed of files when you're required to do so. So in the past, there were various approaches we'd use to this. Within SharePoint, there were library or content type specific controls. We also use SharePoint workflows fairly heavily to clean things up. We still see many organizations relying on manual cleanup. So we'll have spreadsheet schedules and people will be going through and deleting documents on specific dates. Global hold policies are another one that we see that I'd be keen to see the back of. That's basically preserving absolutely everything in your Microsoft 365 tenancy for 5 years or 7 years or 10 years. And then there's obviously a whole host of third-party solutions as well. So the limitations of these approaches. So first of all, the SharePoint library, content type, workflow approaches, the coverage is poor. We're looking at information that's on specific SharePoint sites. Unfortunately, real users aren't always that predictable. There will be information in people's mailboxes, on people's OneDrives, on network drives, and so on. They also rely on users following a very prescribed way of working. So filing things in the right way, tagging things with the right metadata and so on. A lot of these approaches are labor intensive, especially if you're using a spreadsheet to manually go through and clean up your files. Global hold policies are obviously very indiscriminate. So apart from the fact that you can't treat every single piece of data in your organization in the same way, they also make your Microsoft 365 environment hard to maintain. Finally, adding any kind of third-party solutions is going to add expense and platform divergence. So the modern approach, we've got two compliance solutions in Microsoft 365. We've got information governance and records management. Both of these solutions provide classification and governance across a whole bunch of repositories, so across SharePoint, across OneDrive, across Teams, across Exchange, across third-party solutions and network drives. We've got options for manually and automatically classifying data. And our core building block with both of these solutions is retention labels. So while the Compliance Center presents two different solutions, information governance and records management, the underlying building blocks are the same. They're both built on retention labels. So with retention labels, we apply these labels to files and emails for various reasons. Firstly, it could be pure classification, just to classify content according to its business purpose. We can also configure our labels to retain label files for a specified length of time, preserve those files as records, delete them after a specified period, or retain them and then delete them. So you might choose to protect a file from deletion for 7 years and then delete it automatically. And on the right, you can see how this looks for a user. In SharePoint, in this case, you're labeling a file. It's just the same as applying any other metadata. So you can apply retention labels in various ways. You can apply them manually, so that's a user-driven approach, or you can apply them automatically, so it's a pattern-driven approach. Users can also set default retention labels on SharePoint document libraries and also on Outlook folders as well. So if you imagine someone working in an HR team, for example, they might have a folder in their Outlook inbox for job applications, and they might set a label on that folder to automatically delete those applications after 12 months or whatever it might be. Anything they drag into that folder is then automatically labeled, and that configuration is applied. So creating a retention label is straightforward. So you start with a name and description, and then you configure what you want the label to do. So whether you want it to apply retention, how long you want it to keep it for, and what you want to trigger that retention. So you can trigger retention or deletion based on a few different things. You've got the date the file was created, when it was last modified, the date you actually applied the label, or it can be in response to particular events. And we'll look at a little bit more at that shortly. So if you're publishing labels for users to use manually or to configure defaults, you create a label policy. And what you're trying to do here is to make a relevant subset of your labels available at relevant locations. So in this case, we've got a subset of our labels that are relevant to an HR team. We've got employment records, consent agreements, job applications, and we're using a label policy to make those labels available on the mailboxes of the HR team, on the SharePoint sites that the team uses, on their team if they're using Microsoft Teams, and on their OneDrive. So it's about targeting relevant labels to the right people. This is what it looks like behind the scenes. You can see it's fairly straightforward to use. We can toggle on Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, Office 365 groups, and we can apply this label to all of those mailboxes, all of those SharePoint sites, or we can choose specific instances instead. So it's all about targeting specific locations, whether it's mailboxes or SharePoint sites or OneDrives, Office 365 groups, which underpins Teams, and making sure that the right subset of labels are available at those locations. When it comes to automatically applying retention labels, we can apply these labels automatically based on a few different things. So first one is sensitive information types. So this is a pattern matching approach, and we'll hopefully take a closer look at this later. This is looking for specific patterns in your information. So it could be very standard things like credit card numbers, driving license numbers, bank details, tax identifiers. It could be specific words or phrases that are relevant to your organization. It can also be based on property values like the subject of an email or the author of a document. And finally, it could be based on trainable classifiers, which is a machine learning approach. And again, hopefully, if we have time at the end, we'll take a closer look at how that works. The automatic labeling takes up to 7 days. So it's something that runs in the background. It's a continual process once you created the policy. As new content, as new email goes through the system, this policy will automatically label it. So there's a few other clever things around retention labels, retention and governance that we should take a quick look at. So the first is disposition review. So if you don't want something to be deleted automatically when it reaches the end of a retention period, you do have this disposition review option instead. This basically allows you to notify specific people when label items reach the end of their retention period. The reviewer can then access these items, review their list of pending dispositions in the admin center, and they've got a few choices. They can permanently delete these files or emails. They can extend the period of retention, or they can apply a different label if they want to. So it's a more sophisticated approach to just automatically deleting files where you need it. Another more sophisticated approach to retention is event-driven retention. So this allows you to trigger the start of a retention period when something happens. So you're essentially labeling something, but you're not kicking that retention period into action until something specific happens. And the way this works is when you apply a label that's set up in this way, you specify an asset ID. An example here is it's a common example. It's employee records. So if you're storing employee records in Office 365, the chances are you'll retain them indefinitely while that person's working for you. If they leave your organization, at that point, you probably can't justify keeping those items indefinitely. So this is a way of kicking an expiration policy off when something happens. So when an employee leaves your organization, you trigger an event with this asset ID, which in this case we've got an employee number. What that does is it will trigger the expiration on all label files with a matching ID. So the employee leaves, you trigger the event, and the clock starts ticking on anything with that label and that asset ID. You can also use retention labels to mark an item as a record. So this is something that's useful in typically more highly regulated environments. It's where you have to preserve a file, basically make sure that it's not modified, it's preserved in a specific state as evidence if you need it. Labels can do this across all your systems, so across email, across all of your Microsoft 365 repositories. SharePoint and OneDrive also support record versioning, which means you can store specific versions of files as a record and preserve them as evidence as well if you need it. Records management now also includes proof of deletion, which is something a lot of people have been asking for a long time, which basically means that you can log into the admin center and prove that specific records were deleted on specific dates if you need to. The final area to look at here is file plans. So this is a more sophisticated way of managing labels and classification. So typically this is used in more highly regulated environments. It's useful where you've got a lot of labels, where you've got a lot of stakeholders. It allows you to basically build your set of labels on paper or in a CSV file, so you can work with your stakeholders to define exactly what you want your retention policies to be. You build it all in a CSV file, you import it into Microsoft 365, it will create these labels for you automatically. You've got the ability then to export it when you need to review, when you need to revise, and repeat that cycle as often as you want to. So finally, a few good practices in this area. I think the first one is just to call out that retention labels are useful for classification as well as purely for retention and deletion. So it's worth being precise with them. Avoid the temptation to create general purpose labels like retain for 7 years, delete after 3 years. Tie them to specific business content types, tie them to invoices, NDAs, confidentiality agreements, statements of work, whatever it might be, because these labels are useful for classification, for reporting, for understanding what kind of information you're storing beyond the pure how long do you want to keep it for, when do you want to delete it. Second one, publish specific labels to relevant locations. So you might have a whole bunch of labels in the admin center. They're not all going to be relevant to every user. So publish relevant subsets of labels to relevant locations. So publish HR related labels to your HR SharePoint site, finance related labels to your finance site, and so on. And that helps to ensure that users only see labels that are relevant to their job role or to the storage location they're working in. You're not overwhelming them with choice. Okay, so our second area is information protection. So we've got a few challenges here. We want to be able to classify the sensitivity of our information in a consistent way. So regardless of where we're keeping it, whether it's on a file system, in an email, in a document on SharePoint or OneDrive or Teams, we want to be able to classify it using a consistent system. We want to be able to protect information appropriately according to how sensitive it is. That might include encrypting and protecting files and emails, so wherever they go, you maintain the ability to control who can see them, who can forward them, who can print them, and so on. You might also want to provide handling instructions and some sort of visual identification. So that might be headers or footers or watermarking, just some way of showing visually how sensitive an item is. So we've got a few existing approaches here. I didn't want to call these older approaches, as some of them do very much still have a place. Probably the exception to that is password protected files. But we've got things like rights management services. So you might be familiar with AD-RMS and Azure RMS. We've got various solutions for email encryption, and we've got AIP, Azure Information Protection, which is a way of labeling and classifying and encrypting files on file systems and in various other places. So the challenges here, it can be kind of fragmented and inconsistent. So in a lot of cases, we're using different systems across file systems, across cloud apps, across email, to do essentially the same thing, which is to indicate how sensitive our information is and protect it appropriately. That makes it complex as well. You've got to set up multiple tools in multiple places. It can have a negative effect on the user experience. So encrypted files in particular have created challenges for SharePoint and OneDrive users in the past. Those encrypted files basically become impenetrable blocks. You lose the ability to search them, to co-author, and that kind of thing. It can also be very manual, so there's a heavy reliance on users doing the right thing and following the instructions and classifying their information in the right way. So a modern approach is information protection in Microsoft 365, and this has really started to come of age over the last 6 to 12 months. It's really becoming a joined up and well integrated solution. It gives us the ability to classify and protect files and emails. We can now also use the same classification and protection system to protect SharePoint sites, Teams, Microsoft 365 groups. We've got native support for this protection in the Office client app, so there's no need for additional add-ins and downloads. It gives us options for manual and automatic classification. And the core building block here is sensitivity labels. So we can apply sensitivity labels to files and to emails to do various things, to apply headers and footers, to apply watermarking, so the background of our email or document, to actually apply protection, so to encrypt the content and restrict who can access it, who can do various things with it, and to apply rights management. And the image on the right shows you how this looks in any of the client applications, so both in Outlook or in Office, in Excel, in PowerPoint. We can also apply these labels to sites and teams. So in this case, you can see on the right, I'm creating a new team in Microsoft Teams. The first thing I've done is I've chosen my sensitivity level. So that's the first thing I'm prompted to do, is how sensitive is this team going to be? I've chosen highly confidential, and you can see that's restricting what I can then do with that team. So my only privacy option for the team is to create a private team. It also allows us to control external sharing options. So we can, for example, stop team owners from inviting external users into teams with particular classifications. And we can use it to manage whether those teams or SharePoint sites are accessible from unmanaged devices, so devices that aren't enrolled with Intune or Azure AD Hybrid. It also gives us a visual indication of sensitivity as well, so you'll see a label at the top of your site or team just telling you what the classification is. As with retention labels, these things are pretty straightforward to create. You do that from the information protection solution in the Compliance Center. So you start with a name and description. You then choose where you want this label to be used. So you've got the ability here, you can either use it on files or emails, you can use it on groups or sites, or you can use it on everything. And then finally, you choose the type of protection you want to apply. So that might include encryption, rights management, content marking. For groups and sites, we're configuring what we want the privacy options to be, whether we want to allow the owners to add external people, and what we want in terms of allowing people to access from unmanaged devices. You might have noticed the automatic labeling option there. We will come on to that. So publishing labels, again, it's pretty straightforward. We create a label policy to target users with relevant labels. So notice the difference between sensitivity labels and retention labels. Retention labels, we were targeting locations. So we were targeting mailboxes, SharePoint sites, OneDrives, Microsoft 365 groups. With sensitivity labels, we're targeting specific users. So the idea is that the labels we target to that user are universal for that user. So everywhere they work, whether in their email, whichever SharePoint site they're using, whether in their OneDrive, whether they're working in Teams, they have the same set of options available to them for classifying and protecting your information. And that also extends, we'll look at a unified label shortly, that also extends to the file system and to third-party apps if you get into AIP. So we've got a couple of different ways of automatically applying sensitivity labels. We can do it with client-side labeling, which basically works as the user is typing an email or authoring a document. It's scanning what they're doing, and it works almost in real time. It's classifying based on those sensitive information types. So if it matches a pattern in what the user's typing, it will either apply a label automatically, or we can recommend that the user applies a label as well. Service-side labeling works in the background. So this scans SharePoint and OneDrive or emails being sent and received. And again, it classifies based on sensitive information types. Because it's running service side, this gives us the ability to apply those labels at scale. This is what it looks like on the client side automatic labeling. So you can see in this case, I might be typing an email or writing a Word document. I add in a credit card number that matches one of my automatic labeling conditions, and in this case I'm adding a tip. I'm recommending to the user that they change the sensitivity, they apply a label, and they've then got the choice as to whether they do that or not. You can take a more brute force approach and apply these labels automatically, and that's obviously going to depend on the working practices within your organisation. Service-side labeling works in the background. It's worth noting it's not universal. So when we looked at automatically applying retention labels, that works right across every single SharePoint site, every single OneDrive, every single Microsoft 365 group if you want it to. This automatically applying sensitivity labels isn't that universal yet. So you've got a maximum of 10 policies, and each of those policies can target up to 10 specific SharePoint sites or OneDrives. So you can't yet say go and apply sensitivity labels on every single one of my 500,000 SharePoint sites. It may come in time. This is a fairly new capability. You have got the ability to target every single mailbox with these policies if you want to. One important point at the bottom, you can run these policies in simulation mode first to help ensure you're labeling things correctly, which if you're applying protection with labels and locking things down, that's going to be quite important. Couple of specific details to look at. The first one is that sensitivity labels can have sublabels, and the way we typically use these is our top level labels will reflect our classification scheme. So our basic sensitivity level. So in this case, it's non-business, general, confidential, highly confidential, nice and straightforward. We use the sublabels to reflect variations in control. So, for example, on our confidential label, you might have confidential information that you need to remain unencrypted because you need to share it with specific external people. You might have confidential information that you need to share with specific partner organisations, or it might be confidential information that should only be shared within your organisation. So you can set up those sub-levels to give you different ways of applying different constraints at the same sensitivity label. So a point on terminology here just to finish. You might have come across sensitivity labels being called unified labels, or you might have come across the term unified labels. What this means is we're using labels and protection consistently across two different platforms, Microsoft 365 and AIP, as your information protection. So Microsoft 365, we've got our sensitivity labels. That gives us the built-in support for labeling for protection in our Microsoft 365 client app. So when we're using Outlook, Office, Excel, PowerPoint, we've got native support for labeling. AIP gives us some more sophisticated labeling capabilities. It lets us label and protect things on the file system, on network drives. It can integrate with third-party systems, so various cloud storage providers, and extend protection to those apps as well. Unified labels basically means that we're using the same set of labels across both solutions. And the way this works is we do an initial migration of AIP labels into Microsoft 365. You have to go through that step whether you're using AIP or not. It's just one of those configuration exercises you have to do. Once you've done that, Microsoft 365 becomes the master, AIP becomes the replica, and you've got the same set of labels, so that consistent classification system right across everything. So a few good practices just to finish this section. So first of all, on the labeling schema, we've got labels and sub-labels. We need ideally to keep them to a manageable number. So Microsoft recommends something called the 5x5 rule, which means that as an absolute maximum, you should have 5 top-level labels with a maximum of 5 sub-labels for each of those. And that helps to ensure your classification system doesn't get overly confusing. And as we mentioned earlier, the convention is that our top level labels reflect your organizational classification scheme, and then our sub labels give us the ability to have variations in the way we apply controls. Second point is on encryption. So as you've seen, these labels can encrypt and protect content. Do use it judiciously because it can have a negative impact on the user experience. So we generally recommend that you don't set a default label that applies encryption, because that would mean that whenever your users are sending an email to anyone outside your organization who's not covered by a specific label policy, they then have to remove the label every time. Otherwise, the recipient gets an email that they can't read. We'd also recommend that you're cautious with automatic labeling that applies encryption. If you're doing anything that's blocking access and locking things down, it's worth being cautious about doing that automatically, and make sure that's very well tested in simulation mode before you roll it out. Okay, so the final area I want to look at today is data loss prevention. So data loss prevention policies are all about reducing the likelihood of users inadvertently sharing sensitive information with people who shouldn't see it. And this works by detecting when sensitive information is being shared, so whether that's inside or outside the organization, and then taking appropriate action based on that. And that could be anything from just writing to an admin report behind the scenes. It might be popping up a tip for the user, just saying, do you realize you're about to share this with someone outside the organization, right up to fully blocking the action, stopping the users doing what they were doing, and blocking that sharing from happening at all. So there are 3 key elements to any DLP policy. We've got the scope, the conditions, and the actions. So the scope is which platforms you want the policy to cover. The conditions is what has to happen to trigger the policy, and the actions is what you want to do. So first of all, the scope. You can apply these policies to Exchange, to SharePoint, to OneDrive, and to Teams chat and channel messages. So it's worth pointing out that if you're storing files in Teams, they're stored in SharePoint behind the scenes anyway, so that will be covered by the second one down. As with all the policies you saw earlier with retention labels and sensitivity labels, you've got the ability to turn this on as a blanket control or to target specific mailboxes, specific sites, specific OneDrives, and so on. Next are conditions. You can trigger a DLP policy based on a whole bunch of different things. So the most common ones, content contains, that could be sensitive information types again, or it could be content that's labeled either with a retention label or a specific sensitivity label. You might have another condition, which is when the content is shared either externally or internally or both. And as you can see on the right, there's many more of these. You can create conditions that tie all of these things together with logical constructs, with ands and ors. So coverage is really pretty good. I've never yet found a combination that doesn't do what we need to do. And then the actions, we've got a range of controls. So we can write to incident reports. We can notify the user by popping up a policy tip, or we can notify someone else. So for example, if a user is sharing financial information, we can notify the head of finance if we want to. And we've got also a range of more obstructive controls like encrypting, restricting access and so on. We can also allow the user to report false positives and override the policy if we want to. So you can see that on the right hand side and below. So at the bottom, you can see the policy tip. It's warning us that our content appears to contain something that's matching a policy. And then if we click more options, you get the tooltip you can see on the right. So we've got the ability to report an issue, which is basically reporting a false positive. And we've got the ability in this case to override if we want to, so we can make that decision. We've seen the warning, we know it's going to get audited, but we can carry on if we've got business justification to do so. Another one to look at briefly is endpoint data loss prevention. I called this out separately because it works slightly differently. It's currently in preview, so it's not available for production use yet, but it's available to try out. This lets us manage what users can do with sensitive information on Windows 10 devices. So we've got a range of controls available to us. So we can either audit or control whether users can copy content to portable drives, removable media, whether we let them copy this sensitive content to network shares, whether we allow them to print it, and whether we allow them to copy it to cloud apps. We can also block whether they access this sensitive information using unauthorized apps and browsers as well. So you can kind of see the last 2 points there go together. If we're forcing people to use the Chromium-based version of Edge, we can control whether they are able to upload sensitive information to Google Drive, to their own personal OneDrive, and so on. If we use that in conjunction with the last one, we stop them using other browsers that don't give us that ability to control. So between the 2 points, you've got pretty much complete coverage over what users can do with those files. So a few good practices here. This is all really about being a little bit cautious. So DLP policies aren't really the kind of thing that you can just switch on and go away and forget about. You do have to pilot them, you do have to test them, and you do have to monitor them. There are some horror stories out there about organizations that switch on a DLP policy, block the managing director from sending an email, and have to backtrack fairly swiftly on their rollout after that. So general advice is to proceed with caution. Start with test mode, start with reporting only, monitor it carefully, tune it as you go, monitor false positives. And it's something that you should expect to visit fairly regularly, and just make sure it's doing exactly what you want it to do. Okay, so I think we've got time just to have a quick look at some of the building blocks we've mentioned. So one you've heard me mention in all 3 sections is sensitive information types, and this really lies at the heart of a whole bunch of solutions in Microsoft 365 compliance. So what sensitive information types allow us to do is identify sensitive information based on particular patterns. So it's a pattern matching approach. Microsoft make about 160 of these available. So there are built-in classifiers to match passport numbers, national insurance numbers, tax ID numbers, user identification in pretty much every country you can think of, and so on. You can also define your own custom sensitive information types for things that are specific to your organization. So if there are specific project names, specific programs that are unique to your organization that you need to protect, if you've got bespoke employee numbers in a particular format, you can create your own sensitive information types and use policies to flag information based on those. So trivial example over on the right hand side, we've got a custom sensitive information type that looks for content that contains the phrase Project Bermuda with the word disappear within 30 characters of that. So most sensitive information policies will look something like this. You've got your main criteria or pattern at the top, and then you've got a load of supporting elements that basically add confidence to the match. So you'll see that a lot of the sensitive information types, the policies based on them, are based on confidence levels. You'll see a percentage number against them. And those percentages typically relate to how many of these supporting elements you've got around that content. So it's almost like a fuzzy logic style of matching. You're looking for specific patterns, but you're building confidence by adding supporting elements. And just looking at how all these different building blocks relate. So you can see sensitive information types sit right in the middle. We can use them as criteria either directly for our DLP policies, or we can use them as criteria for automatically applying retention labels and sensitivity labels. Retention labels and sensitivity labels in turn give us criteria for applying DLP policies, and our DLP policies can apply sensitivity labels. So you can see this all gets quite incestuous. There's basically a close interrelationship between all of these things. You'll also see DLP policies as the building block of some of the other areas in Microsoft 365 compliance that we haven't looked at today. So things like insider risk management, communication compliance, they build heavily on what we've got in DLP policies. Next one to mention is trainable classifiers. So this is currently in preview, so it's not in production yet, but it probably won't be long. So sensitive information types, as you've seen, they're very good at matching specific patterns in data. So things like driving license numbers, passport numbers, any kind of ID number, there's a very specific pattern. You can use regular expressions. Sensitive information types are very good at matching those types of content. Other types of content don't work so well for sensitive information types. So if you think about something like invoices, for example, invoices can take a whole variety of different formats, from a sort of scribbled note to heavily formatted tables. There's less in the way of specific patterns you can look for to automatically identify an invoice. So trainable classifiers give us an alternative approach for these kind of less predictable formats, and it uses machine learning. I'll show you how that works in just a second at high level. We can use these trainable classifiers to feed into retention label policies, to sensitivity label policies, and into things like communication compliance, which we haven't covered today. The way this works at a high level, you start with a seeding process. So you give your classifier somewhere between 50 and 500 examples of matching content. So if you're trying to match invoices, you give it 50 to 500 invoices, as diverse as possible. It will go away and it will build an initial algorithm based on that content. You then move to a test phase, so you give it up to 10,000 items to test, and some of them should be positive matches, so some of them should be invoices, and some of them should be not invoices, something else. The model then goes through and it has a go at classifying all of your test data. You've then got the ability to go through that test data and give it feedback. So this is kind of a training phase. So you provide feedback in each case, whether you agree with it, whether you disagree with it, or whether you're unsure. So basically whether or not it's classified the item correctly. Finally, once you're happy, you can publish it. Once you publish it, you can make use of it in compliance solutions. Final one, I'm only going to mention this very, very briefly, is SharePoint Syntex. So this is basically taking things to the next level. It's taking what we can do with trainable classifiers and just going even further. It's currently available as an add-on subscription. It's brand new, so it was announced at the Ignite conference last month. This uses really advanced AI-driven analysis and classification. So it's using things like OCR, optical character recognition, to really understand your content, to try and extract the semantics, to apply metadata, enhance your search processes, and this can also feed into all of those compliance solutions that we've looked at. So this is probably one to watch in the coming months. So on that note, I'm going to hand over to Lisa, who's moderating today. Lisa, do you want to give us should we say, top 3 questions?
Yep. So we might not manage to get through all of these. If we don't get to your questions when we send the recording, feel free to come back with anything specific. The first one, probably most popular, is around licensing. What licenses do we need to run these tools?
Okay. So licensing can be complex. I don't think anyone would argue with that. Our account managers probably know the details better than I do, but at a high level, the baseline for any of this stuff is either an E3 license or it's business premium if you're under 250 seats, I believe. So they will give you the kind of entry level compliance functionality in each of these areas. So that's typically the ability to apply retention labels manually or to set defaults on folders, on libraries. Similarly with sensitivity labels, the ability to publish them and apply them manually. And with DLP policies, I believe it gives you the ability to target Exchange, SharePoint and OneDrive, but not Teams chat and conversations. So to get the more sophisticated functionality, you're looking at moving up to either an E5 license or the E5 compliance add-on. And what that does is basically gives you the automated stuff. So when it comes to retention labels, it will give you the ability to apply those retention labels automatically, and also to use some more advanced things like the disposition review and the file plan. For sensitivity labels, again, it will give you the ability to apply those labels automatically rather than manually. And then for DLP, I believe E5 opens up the ability to target Teams channels and Teams conversations, and also the ability to use the Endpoint DLP. I think that pretty much covers it. Do check with your licensing providers on the details though, because it does change.
Brilliant. I've got another one. You said 5x54 sensitivity labels. What about retention labels?
Okay, so in terms of the total number of retention labels.
Yes, I think that's, yeah.
Okay, so there's not really any hard and fast rules on total number of labels. It's really however many is relevant to your organization. So how many different business content types you can identify that have different requirements, different retention requirements, different expiration deletion requirements, and so on. Probably where you do want to be more judicious is in how many labels you publish to any one location. So I would say even if you've got 50, 60 labels altogether, you probably want to avoid showing users more than 5 or so in any one location. Any more than that, just from a usability point of view, it's going to get confusing, and people are going to be more likely to mislabel things.
Nice. I've got another one here. So you mentioned password protected files are bad practice nowadays. Why is this?
Okay, so I'm sure there's still a case for password protected files in some circumstances. In most cases, I'd say information protection gives you a better approach. So if you password protect a file and you store it in SharePoint, you've then got to use 2 different sets of credentials to get to that file, because you've got to log into SharePoint and your access level will be checked against wherever that file is stored initially. So that's one password plus MFA or whatever else you use. You've then got to use a completely different password to actually get into the file. If you set up something like information protection, you're using the same key for both. So if I store a file on SharePoint and I apply information protection, the users who have access to it, basically they're only proving their identity once. They log in to Azure AD behind the scenes. That gives them access both to SharePoint, and it proves their identity for the purposes of information protection as well. So wherever that file goes, even if it's downloaded, copied, uploaded somewhere else, basically anytime you want to open that file, you would use your corporate credentials to do that. And obviously, depending on how sophisticated your identity management is, if you're using things like MFA, conditional access, any other constraints, that's also going to apply to information protection as well, because whenever you prove your identity, whenever you log in, those constraints apply. So it's basically using the same key. There are probably some advantages in usability as well. So for unified labels, SharePoint and OneDrive can index your content. So things like co-authoring will continue to work. Your content will continue to show up in search results for those people who do have the rights to see it. So it's just generally a much more integrated approach, if that makes sense.
Brilliant. We've got a few more, but I think if we could wrap up there, what we'll do is we'll be sending the slides and recording to everyone within the next hour. If you do have any questions that were unanswered, please feel free to reply to the email. We can get back to you, or you can get Jason answering your questions. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks very much, Jason.
Thanks very much, guys.